Well, hi everyone, Patricia Worby, Alchemy Therapies here, and here's another in my series of conversations with colleagues and friends about the subject of mind-body interaction. And I'm delighted to once again welcome my very good friend, B. Innes, who is a naturopathic nutritionist, if I remember correctly, or I don't know, naturopath, nutritionist, whatever. Who's going to talk to us today a little bit about how your biography becomes your biology, how what happens to you, particularly in childhood, is very significant because it sort of changes the way your mind and body conceive of threat versus safety. So, which sounds all very, very interesting, but the detail is all in the detail. So B, I'd really like to hear a little bit about what happened to you, because I know your story is quite a difficult one, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, as my training as a naturopath progressed, I kind of started to learn about, the effect of trauma on the body, which of course you know all about. And one of the things that really kind of was interesting was that, even in the womb, the health of the mother can really kind of dictate how your wiring's set up, even kind of, before you even come into the universe. And certainly around my kind of birth, I think my mum would have been under an awful lot of stress and fear as a single parent, with rather dodgy choice in father. So yeah, I think she would have been quite kind of fearful, and she was actually, as a person, she was quite fearful, and all of those fear hormones, kind of coursing through her system would have affected me even in the womb. So before I even came out, I think I was kind of on the back foot, if you like. And then kind of, yeah, my story. So grew up with a single parent. My dad was never kind of around, really. He was kind of in and out. Had a colourful past, shall we say. I won't go into too much detail, but he wasn't Mr. Reliable, let's put it that way. And I kind of have memories. I mean, my first memory, being 3, was like, he bought me this poster of a horse, and I was just so disgusted that that was all he'd ever given me. I just remember standing on the bed. My mum had like proudly put it up on the wall, standing on the bed, and I ripped it off the wall, and I was having a tantrum and ripping this poster up. And somewhere in my little 3-year-old brain, I must have been thinking, why is this all I've got from this man who's supposed to be my father? I'm sure at 3 you can't kind of really logically figure that stuff out, but I was feeling that lack, that other kids had a father, and somehow I was missing something, and was it something that was wrong with me? And I never felt very comfortable around him when he did come to the house, which wasn't very often, and usually he'd turn up when he was in trouble. And I think quite early on, I think he broke into the house one time, and I remember from that moment on being quite scared of the dark, because of that incident. And so quite small, kind of having a lot of fear, feeling fearful around him, feeling fearful, picking up on my mum's fear that he might, come into the home or harm us in some way, which I don't think he would have done, to be fair. But your reality becomes what you're being told, doesn't it? So
Absolutely.
And what you're witnessing. So, even before I got to 5, I think I was set up for fear and fight and flight. And then he basically, my mum got an injunction out against him, and he was like off the scene for many, many years. And even that in itself was quite traumatic in terms of my perception of my father and what my mum had told me about him. And then around about 7, and it all gets a bit vague, I started to have kind of like memories of my mum starting to drink quite heavily. And then life just kind of went crazy after that. So my background was that I grew up with an alcoholic mother. My sister, who was 10 years older than me, pretty much brought me up. I didn't know this till years later, but my sister was shielding me from a lot of physical and mental abuse when I was really little. And my mum was, partly because she was so fearful, partly because, you know, obviously she had a mental health issue. We would only be allowed out to school. And after that, I'd be locked in the house when we came home from school. I wasn't kind of like going out to play with other children. So obviously that's going to have had an effect. And when we were in the house, it was very much a little bit like, you know, don't wake the scary monster, because whenever she woke up, she would basically start with verbal abuse. Not really directed at me, more directed at my sister, but it was still a really unpleasant atmosphere to be around, and quite scary. And I remember kind of being always walking on eggshells, always being scared, always feeling scared that we'd set her off, or, you know, and kind of like strange memories, like, you know, at night she'd want us to go to bed at like ridiculously early. So we'd be like, she'd be like screaming at us to kind of go to bed at 6 o'clock in the evening, and we all slept in one room. And me and my sister would like sneak out into the bathroom with a torch, and we'd read under torchlight in the bathroom to try not to wake her up. And or my sister, bless her, she'd make like little kind of hand puppets on the wall, like shadow puppets, to try and keep me amused while we were lying there in terror in the same bedroom as my mum, trying not to wake her up. And she'd just do things to kind of keep me occupied and keep my sanity, really. She used to do some lovely things like little Cindy doll treasure hunts, and so kind of on it went for years, until one Christmas, she'd had enough. And as I say, I was shielding her from she was shielding me rather from a lot of the physical and verbal abuse. And one Christmas she decided to take an overdose, when I was about,
sister or your mum? Sorry.
my sister,
Right.
when I was about 10.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, I just remember being numb. I remember sitting there like on Christmas Day watching The Parent Trap and just being absolutely numb, because my sister was my world. She was like my mother. I was just devastated that she was going to leave me. And anyway, she told, my nan was home at the time. We all lived in my nan's house, and she told my nan what she'd done, and my nan phoned the GP, and they came out and basically encouraged her to be sick. I don't really think she'd taken that many tablets. But of course that triggered the whole social services getting involved, and as a result of that, they basically told my mum that if she didn't sober up, that I'd be taken into care. So the next thing we knew, she was like being carted off in an ambulance, and she'd agreed to go into rehab, and she went off into a rehab unit when I was about 10 for what seemed like an eternity. It probably wasn't that. Time is weird when you're a kid, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
But yeah, and then we'd visit her in rehab, and then, you know, obviously it was a psychiatric unit, so there was some people with quite some severe mental health issues in there, and that can be quite scary for a child to be around as well, kind of witnessing people having kind of delusions in the unit when we were there. And also, weirdly, when we were visiting my mum one time, we saw my sister saw my dad in the street, and you know, she was trying to hurry me away before he saw us. And it turns out he did actually see us. I found this out years later. But again, all of that fear, you know, feeling like you're under threat all the time.
Isn't it? Unremitting.
Yeah, it was absolutely unremitting. And I actually, you know, I thought when my mum went into hospital, I was quite happy, because then suddenly the house was calm, and I had the impression that suddenly I'd have some freedom. But my sister was so terrified of being responsible for this little child. She was only 20 at the time, that, you know, she really held the reins tight as well. and then everything kind of went crazy when my mum got back out. She announced that she was moving out because we all lived in my nan's house, and she was taking me with her, and she was leaving my sister behind. And my sister kind of quite rightly felt really neglected and hurt, and kind of from that moment on basically took it that I was the issue. That whole kind of sibling rivalry, you know. So my mother, my sister, who was like my mother, then turned into this person that suddenly seemed to hate me. I remember the day we moved out, she kind of threw a bottle at my head from down the stairs. And so lots of kind of like trauma before I'd even kind of gone off to secondary school, really. And then moved in with my mum. Me and my mum got this flat, and one Christmas she said, you know what, I'm just going to have a little drink because it's Christmas. And I was like begging her not to have that drink. I knew what would happen even at that young age. And yeah, it just all the abuse, the violence, the verbal abuse, the mental abuse that my sister had been hiding me from, shielding me from, all came my way from that day on for years and years and years. And it was literally 24/7. She would get up in the middle of the night and she would start screaming and shouting and ranting. As soon as I walked in from school, you'd never know what was going to happen, whether she was going to be drunk. She'd have like one day off a week, and you'd always walk in and hope that that was going to be the day off that she'd had while she was basically trying to recover from. She'd drink like a bottle and a half of vodka, you know, the big bottles of vodka that I don't know whether you still get them now.
Yeah.
She could go through a bottle and a half of vodka a night.
Man, that's serious.
Yeah, I mean, astonishing really that she never got liver failure.
Yeah,
But
yeah, absolutely.
and she didn't actually pass away from alcohol. She was sober 10 years before she died, but obviously the alcohol had done a lot of damage to her body and her mind.
Yeah.
So yeah, just kind of really traumatic, physical violence, locked in the house again. And I remember like pretty much every day I would go, we lived in a council flat, and I'd go up to the top of the council flats and I'd have a conversation with myself about whether or not I have the guts to throw myself off the top of the council flats. So you kind of just survive, you know, you just I don't know how I did. I think I threw myself into my studies, which is a whole other conversation about later life.
Yes.
And I drown the noise out with headphones. I just try and drown her out with music. So music became really, really important to me as well.
Those two things are still in your life now, aren't they? That's so interesting. Yeah, the overworking and the music love is still there.
Yeah,
they're coping
absolutely.
strategies.
Yeah. You know, the music's a great one, but the overworking, not so great a strategy, really, as we've talked about. So yeah, so that was it really. And then about 15, she said to me, I just started rebelling, and said, you know, I'm off, I'm out, I'm going to go out. And the first time I said I was going to go out with my friend, she said, if you go out, when you come back, I'll have killed myself. So obviously the whole time I was out, I was like in terror of what I would come back and find. Of course it was all fine. And then somehow, I don't know how, I managed to get through my GCSEs. I ran away twice and went to live with my nan. But both times she sent me back because my mum would threaten to do something to herself, and my nan would feel like, you know, what can I do? This is my daughter, I don't want her to kill herself. So she'd send me back to that environment, and just, yeah, very, very hard times. And then I remember we talked about this a few weeks ago, like I had a conversation with myself at the top of the flats one day and said, you know, if nothing changes in the next month, I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it. I'm going to kill myself. And I met this guy at work who literally saved my life. And, you know, we dated and it was fun, and he distracted me from all the hell that I was going through. And for a time, you know, he took my mind off stuff. I think I was 17 back then. And then one night I went out with some guys that I worked with, and I came back home, and my mum had locked me out of the flat, and I was trying to get back in, and I remember her just screaming on the other side of the door, and there was part of me that really didn't want to sleep outside on the landing and the council flats, and another part of me that really didn't want her to let me back in because of what would be inside. Anyway, she did let me back in eventually, and I got into bed, stuck the duvet over my head, and there was never any privacy. She'd want you to have the doors open all the time so that she could see everything that was going on. And she walked in the bedroom, and I heard her, and I thought, you know, I'd always freeze when I heard her walking around at night, because you never knew what she was going to do. She was so temperamental. And this time I felt something, you know, patting me on the head, and I'm like, what's that? And I just stayed there like frozen, and then it happened again, and I thought, you need to look. And so I pulled the duvet off, and she was there with a claw hammer in her hand. And yeah, hitting me on the head with it. She didn't do any damage, not physically. Well, maybe she did, but you know, nothing obvious. But psychologically, I mean, you just can't imagine, can you really?
No, the person that's supposed to be protecting you is not only unpredictable and unreliable, but she's now trying to hurt you deliberately.
Yeah. And at that point, the guy that I was seeing at that time, you know, me and the other guy had split up, and I started seeing somebody else, and he was a lot older than me. He was about 10 years older, and he was like, you're not living there anymore. You're moving in with me today. And again, somebody else came along and saved my life. I mean, the universe kind of intervenes, doesn't it?
Well, it does for some people, and it has for you, and thank God, because you're here. And you've made something of your life, and you know, but so many don't get there. You know, they descend into alcoholism themselves, or suicide, or whatever. I mean, I don't have any concept of what it's like to grow up like that. It doesn't match my experience, but the fear does, the fear and the unpredictability, because I certainly grew up with that. But in my case, it was my father's illness, and we never knew from one time to the next, you know, how he'd be, would he be in hospital or not? And it was just that unpredictability and the sense of imminent something bad about to happen. I think that's what I grew up with, and that's certainly landscaped me for a threat response like no other. So I didn't mean to interrupt you there, but so you did escape. That's the important thing.
I did escape, and I went off to university, and that was my big escape plan. But everything was, you know, I always worked way harder than anyone else, because I felt like my life depended on it. You know, my life depended on me getting my A levels, because that was my escape route. And I'd hold down jobs while I was trying to do my A levels, and then I'd be trying to figure out, you know, how many hours would I have to work to be able to actually move out now, and while studying. And I always put immense pressure on myself, because it was so horrific living in that atmosphere that you just wanted to escape. And you were always trying to think of ways that, you know, you could get out. But you know, I got out. I went to university, and things weren't easy, really. I was quite damaged. I started drinking when I was 15. I was never an alcoholic, but I do have addictive tendencies, mainly towards work. But you know, they got kind of directed in other ways as well. And so I would like a drink. I mean, luckily my body could never really tolerate it that well. And certainly I used alcohol, and later on I used, you know, cigarettes and recreational drugs to try and hide from the pain. I didn't want to feel anything. I really didn't want to go there. I just wanted to have a good time. And of course, when you've been locked in the house for however many years, you suddenly got your freedom. You're gonna go a bit wild. So luckily I didn't go too wild until after I got my degree.
Well done.
Otherwise I might not have got it. But yeah, that was kind of my escape route.
And so, like with me, after I'd escaped, because I went to university as well and escaped, and that was definitely similar, I then did okay for a few years before the shit hit the fan, as it were. But your story was a little bit, I think you had a shorter time between that and the first symptoms hitting you. Is that right?
Yeah, well, so I left home when I was 17, and then 18, left to go to university, and then I got ill when I was 24, physically ill. But in between that time, I mean, all the time when I look back, especially as a naturopath, you know, I was starting to get symptoms. So I was starting to get really dry skin. So we know that stress causes dehydration, to the point where my skin would flake off. And this was when I was about 11.
Yeah.
And then I was getting, by the time I was 15, I was getting eczema, I was getting allergies. By the time I was 21, I was hay fever. By the time I was 23, gastrointestinal issues.
Yeah.
So all the time it was building and building, and you know, I went down the conventional route and was given drugs that suppressed the symptoms, and all that toxicity was going deeper, and I didn't really understand what vegetables were, or you know, water was, or so I wasn't giving my body what it needed, and I was giving it exactly what it didn't need, plus all of that backdrop of that continual fight and flight. So it was kind of no surprise really, and as well, I had a couple of suicide. They weren't suicide attempts, they were more cries for help. But there were a couple of times where I took, you know, a fair whack of paracetamol, not really enough to do anything particularly impressive, but enough to annoy my liver quite significantly, you know. So you know, you could see how it was all building. And then when I got to 24, I got what appeared to be some kind of flu-like virus, and I went to the GP and said, do you know what, I don't feel like I'm recovering from this. And I said, I think I've had glandular fever. And he just laughed at me, and he said, you'd know if you had glandular fever. And I thought, well, I kind of do know, because I feel like, you know, we're hearing about long COVID now, aren't we? Well, it's post-viral fatigue, and that's exactly what I had. I had some kind of flu-like episode, and then, you know, just absolute debilitating fatigue. I was struggling to stand up in the shower. I was getting dizzy spells as I was walking to work. And his advice to me was to go jogging, which we now know is the worst possible thing that you can do, because the cells aren't making energy efficiently. And that's what's causing the symptoms, because your body is wanting to be horizontal to just keep your organs running. So, you know, the worst thing I could do was go jogging, but blindly listen to him, went jogging every single day. And you would ask, well, how did you manage to do that when you were so fatigued? And it was sheer willpower. I just pushed through and pushed through and pushed through. And again, we know that's the worst thing that you can do.
Particularly
and then
for women, actually, as it turns out.
Okay.
Men have more testosterone, which allows them to push through. This is why we think it's more a female problem. Whereas for women, you have to push through on adrenaline, and that's what weakens the adrenals, and then you've got adrenal dysfunction as well.
That's interesting. I didn't know that distinction. So yeah, I was working one day. I was temping in London, and I was stood at the photocopier, and I couldn't figure out how to put the piece of paper that was in my hand into the ring binder. It was like my brain had just completely malfunctioned. I couldn't understand how to open the ring binder. I couldn't understand how to place the paper into it and close it. And that absolutely petrified me. And I was like, this is not me needing to do some more exercise. There's something seriously wrong here. I took myself off to A&E, and they said, oh, we think you've got a virus, and you just need to go home and rest for 3 days. And at that point, I thought, you know what? I'm going to move back to Manchester, where I went to uni, because a lot of my friends are there and they'll support me. And I know that, you know, something really serious is going on. It took me a year to get a diagnosis of myalgic encephalomyelitis, which we know as ME, chronic fatigue. And really that diagnosis, you know, I went to a few doctors in the meantime. One doctor told me to eat scones, and it later turned out I was celiac, but he decided that you can't be ill at 24.
Yeah.
So I just needed some home cooking, go away and have some scones.
Yeah.
That was an interesting response. I had a benefits doctor that just completely ridiculed me throughout the whole assessment, and told me that I needed to stop hanging around with couch potato friends.
Yeah.
And you know, that whole
misunderstanding, isn't there? And a lot of, well, there was then, I think that not so much now, but still exists.
Still there, but not as much. And yeah, that kind of whole aftermath of ME's yuppie flu, and you know, and it's you know, these people they just need to push themselves, and they're just lazy. And of course now we know there's lots and lots of evidence that this condition is physical.
Yes.
And that, you know, various pathways in the body are not functioning correctly. And my whole job as a naturopathic nutritionist is to figure out what all of those bits of that jigsaw are, and I'm still figuring out bits of mine. And we talked on the last interview that we did, you know, some of my bits like Lyme disease and mycotoxins. Been ill since I was 24, only found out that these things were affecting me last year. So, you know, it's a big journey to go on, and it's great to have a team of people on your side that understand kind of functional medicine, but also what you do, Patricia, with the link between the body and mind, because for years I absolutely denied that link. Because I'd spent so long trying to explain to people I have a physical illness. This is not my imagination. This is not me needing to try harder. It's not me needing to go and do some exercise, you know. All of the not well-meaning advice that I was getting was actually the worst possible advice that you could give anyone with ME. But and trying to explain that to somebody, you know, people would treat you like it was all in your head. So I spent so long trying to prove that it was physical that I totally cut off that my body had any connection with my mind. And of course, we know that the body and mind work together. We're not cut off at the head. And that in any physical illness, I believe that there's always some kind of emotional element, unresolved emotion, unresolved trauma often. You know, there's the adverse childhood events study, isn't there, that shows that if you've had so many numbers of adverse childhood events, you're more likely to contract some kind of physical health condition in later life.
Yeah, there's a huge predictive effect, and it's dose response relationship as well, which is always a good point if you want to convince somebody medical that something is real. The more adverse childhood events you have, the worse your health outcomes are, and it's predictable and it's constant. And so it raises the really important question that what happens to you in childhood, how that changes your brain also changes your body, because your brain and your body are communicating all the time in various ways. And so if you're making you're hypersensitizing your brain to threat, it's going to start with things like skin issues, because you're going to start with overreacting to things, and then as you said, it's going to go deeper. What we're not saying is that you've made it up, that it's all a psychological thought process that you've decided to be ill, because in fact this doesn't even involve the thinking brain at all. It's all the back part of your brain. So it's not the same as it's in your head, like you were being told it's in your head and you need to try harder. What we're actually saying is there are physiological processes that emanate from these psychological imprints of fear. I mean, fear was the big one in your life. And fear actually changes your hormonal balance. I know you know all this, but so you are actually responding with that HPA axis, we call it, the hypothalamus, pituitary and adrenal, sort of picking up the threat symptoms and translating them down into your body. So you're getting all sorts of things, but usually what happens with the body is it starts externally and then it starts to go internal and more protracted and deeper. So, you know, the question you were never asked, what happened to you? What's happening to you now? Nobody ever asked you, and that's such a sad thing. And look, you know, I know there's more to your story. We're going to have to do another one because we've touched on the
not even talked about the trauma of actually being ill and being dependent on carers. And
which is one for another time, I think. But just to reiterate to people that these experiences are common. They happen to very many people. You might not have grown up with an alcoholic parent, but 55% of people we now know from the latest studies had some form of adverse childhood experience, and usually more than one. And that can be bereavement. It can be, addiction, as in your case. It could be birth trauma is a big one. School bullying, being different. Yeah, it's so many different things, and it can be the absence of support as well when you needed it, and being unsupported in times of difficulty. And so, you know, I really think we've got to wake up to this, because it's coming. You know, people who are getting long COVID are not being asked what sort of life were you living before you got ill, what was going on for you, how much stress are you under. That conversation isn't happening, and it needs to happen. And so anyway, your story is one of hope. I think when we do the next one, which I'll link to from this one, and we talk a little bit about your adult experience, I think people will agree with me that nobody should have to go through what you went through, but it's still happening. And that's why we're doing these videos, actually, is to highlight what is going on behind closed doors in isolation, because this disease is not the same as heart disease or cancer, in the sense of you will be put through a series of interventions, and you'll have support groups, and people will know about what you're going through. This is a silent, hidden disease that lurks unseen in society, and that's why we're doing these videos. And thank you so much for being so honest about your experience and what, you know, what's happened to you, because it's just, folks, if you haven't had quite the same set of circumstances as Bea here, you will undoubtedly have had some issues in your childhood which were unpredictable. That's number one. Unsupported, that's number two. You know, it doesn't have to be as severe as what you've had, but if it has those two things, that they're overwhelming to the nervous system, this is where it sets into the body, and this whole lifetime of effects begins to play out. So, well, look, we're going to have to do another, so we will.
No.
But if people want to get hold of you, how can they get hold of you?
So you can get hold of me. My website is healthybe.co.uk. I'm a naturopathic nutritionist. I specialise in gut health and also mold sickness now, from my own experience, which I'm ploughing my way through as we speak. And I'm on, I think my Facebook page is Healthy Bee Naturopathy. And I think that's my Instagram handle as well. I'm useless with social media, but yeah, I think they're the main ways to get hold of me. But the easiest way is to go on my website, and I offer a free 30-minute health and wellbeing review. So if anyone wanted to come and work with me, I put together kind of programs to kind of do health coaching and support people through the process of trying to figure out what the bits are of their jigsaw, and support them with trying to kind of unravel that, and diet and lifestyle and supplements and all of those fabulous things that we know can make a difference. And you know, just a little spoiler alert, you know, the next part of the story is where I became bedridden for like almost 8 years, and what happened to me during that, and the trauma of that itself, and what went on. And I'm now, you know, working and able to, you know, support other people. So
I hear so great. Well, thank you. And yeah, we do need to know the whole story. I think it's all part of who you've become and why you are the way you are, and we all need to get a little bit more honest, I think, about the suffering that's out there and how we can recover and how we can heal. And I know that's a big part of where we are, you know, working now in a new health group, which we're very excited about, the Greenwood Holistic Health Group, and we're going to be doing a lot more videos and podcasts, I think, on this subject. So but for the moment, thank you so much. Folks, if you like what you hear, please subscribe, and you can find me on alchemytherapies.co.uk. Bye for now, everyone. Bye.
Bye.